Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to another exciting live session of Avid Online. And a special welcome to participants joining an Avid program for the first time. Please refer to the chat box for more information on the work that we do and information on our partners for this evening's program. For those who have been tuning in through the year, I'd like to say thank you for staying with us through this journey as we've transitioned online. Today, we look back on this year. It has certainly been a challenging one for all of us. And yet, at Avid, it has brought us a tremendous opportunity to innovate for the times and to continue the work we believe in seamlessly and inventively. Our digital further learning campaign, Avid Online, debuted on the 1st of April 2020 and has moved from strength to strength. Now we enter our ninth month of programming and have completed over 140 programs online. In fact, tonight is the 144th program, and we're so proud to have successfully leveraged the digital medium to do our part to support the creative community and to maintain a continuous dialogue with our audiences. Our live sessions and pre recorded episodes have been only successful because of our audiences who keep coming back and continue to engage and learn, giving truth to our mantra that learning never stops. As 2021 approaches, we endeavor to scale new heights while continuing to spread the positivity of the arts to uplift, educate, and inspire our community. And this brings me to our evening session. The University of Edinburgh and Avid Learning present Past Present, Reinventing Heritage, a live session on reviving, repurposing, and updating heritage spaces in a conscious and transformative way with architect, writer, and professor, University of Edinburgh, Ed Hollis. For more about our esteemed speaker for this evening, please refer to his very impressive bio that has been posted in the chat section. In today's session, Professor Hollis will explore keywords of renowned architects like Carlo Scarpa and Geoffrey Bawa to show how they have made very different use of the past they found themselves around in order to make a very different future. Building on these international paradigms, he will also examine ways in which architects are dealing with the past in Indian cities through particular projects. Please note the session will last about 75 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A in which Ed will be taking questions, so do keep posting them in the Q&A box throughout. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in. Over to Ed, and look forward to a fascinating session.
Thank you very much, Asad, for that. And thank you, Avid, for inviting me to speak with you this evening. I would second what Asad has said about the extraordinary way that Avid has embraced the digital over the last 6 months and more. I first encountered Avid a couple of years ago coming to do a talk in Mumbai, and now here I am sitting in a snowy living room in Edinburgh in Scotland talking to you. And as an evidence of the kind of extraordinary digital world we're living in, I was having a conversation with Asad about a little dog I used to have when I was a child in London, and my stepsister who's in Sri Lanka, where the original owner of the dog now lives, sort of caught the conversation too. So there are extraordinary global repercussions and possibilities in what we're doing. I would also like to thank very much Amrita Sadarangani, who is Edinburgh University's representative in India, working with the incredibly important partnerships we have with those of you in India and across South Asia. I teach interior design at Edinburgh College of Art, where we have the privilege and enjoy teaching a lot of students from South Asia and talking with them about the relevance of what we do there. I'm going to share my screen just now. Great. So yes, my subject this evening is entitled Past, Present and Reinventing Heritage. To give some advertising to some subsequent Avid events, I note that the next two coming up one is a panel discussion about heritage in India, and then one about seeing India from the outside in a couple of weeks' time as well. This, in a sense, might sit in relationship, or what I'm going to say might sit in relationship to those particular things as well. So I'm going to be talking about heritage, but I want us particularly to think about this word reinventing. I'm Professor of Interior Design, which means that my discipline, or the discipline that I'm teaching and learning about with my students, is one about reinventing the existing world. Interior designers don't make things up from nothing. They change what already exists. And that is very much the subject of this lecture that I want to pursue. So this is not just a talk about heritage. At least it's not just a talk about the past. Instead, it's a talk about what we do with the past in the present in order to create a new future. And what I want to suggest to you is something along the lines of what the playwright Bertolt Brecht said here, that in a sense anybody can be creative. It's rewriting other people that's difficult. Anybody can be creative. It's rewriting other people that's difficult. And what I want to look at are some of the difficulties and, as we'll see, some of the opportunities that lie in rewriting other people. It's important perhaps that a playwright said this. Somebody who works in the theatre is somebody who's used to the idea that there might be a script. There might be a play written by Shakespeare, for example. And that play might have been played hundreds and hundreds of times over hundreds and hundreds of years. So far, so straightforward, but should one do exactly the same as what was done the last time? Of course not. The point about a really fantastic performance of a piece of Shakespeare is it brings something entirely new to the story. At the same time as the actors going through exactly the same words and motions and stories that were written into the script in the first place. So rewriting, reperforming, resharing what exists is a tremendous creative act. It's also an act which we haven't all got right yet all the time. This is a quotation from Jorge Otero Pylos, who is Professor of Building Preservation at Columbia University in New York. And I think there's a really interesting thought here. He talks about preservation. He could be talking about conservation, about heritage activity per se. He says it's become an experimental field for architecture. It's a way to practice architecture outside the dominant field of corporate or star architecture, that is, creating new iconic buildings. Instead, actually, what he's suggesting is that the ways in which we reuse the past in itself can be an experiment. They're an experiment that we haven't solved yet. We don't know what the final answer is, and that's what makes this field so exciting. I'm going to give you a very quick cook's tour of my own career, and in a sense why I might be keen to talk about this. So I studied architecture at Cambridge University and then at Edinburgh University in the early 1980s 90s, and architecture has always been a passion of mine. This is an image that I looked at when I was young, and it was a kind of dream of what I imagined would happen to me. Instead, I hope that what happened to me was rather more exciting. My first experience of working in architecture was in Sri Lanka, where I had the good fortune to work for Geoffrey Bawa towards the end of his career. And this is the first building project I was engaged on, and I'm going to be talking a little more about it in a little while. When I returned to the UK, I worked for the architect Richard Murphy in Edinburgh, who was, in a sense, not just an innovative and exciting architect in his own right, but a great scholar of the works of the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa, who I'm going to be exploring a little bit more later on in the lecture too. And then at the turn of the millennium, I began life as an academic, teaching interior architecture and now interior design. And during that time, I've been lucky to engage in some more experimental practices. So what I'm going to be doing during this lecture is perhaps exploring those three strands of activity, or four strands of activity. First of all, what does architecture mean in the first place? Secondly, the idea of practicing with existing buildings in Sri Lanka. Secondly, practicing with existing buildings in the UK and Europe. And thirdly, more recent experimental practices with architecture too. In the last couple of years, and it's thanks in no small part to Amrita organising sort of engagements with India a couple of years ago with colleagues of mine from Edinburgh College of Art, and also thanks to Avid, I've been working on a couple of projects in India relating to how we might retell stories about existing buildings and existing heritage in India. So the first of those that I'm currently working on, it's work in progress, is in a sense about one very small glass room in a small Raula in southern Rajasthan. And the second, at the other end of the spectrum, is looking and working with the Asansol Heritage Research Group in West Bengal, exploring the colonial and industrial heritage of a Raj railway town, Asansol, on the border between West Bengal and Jharkhand. So I'd like to return to this image at that point and start by perhaps explaining some of the assumptions or why, to explore a little why this issue of the past and the present and the reinvention of heritage might actually matter. So let's imagine this is me, I'm 15, I'm lying on top of a column with my architectural history books, and I'm looking out at this image. This image is called The Architect's Dream, and it was painted by an American painter, Thomas Cole, in 1838. And I think it shows some of the assumptions that underlie some of our own assumptions about what architecture is. Go into gorgeous design bookshops and you might find lots of books about glossy, perfect, beautiful buildings which are photographed on sunny days without a cloud in the sky and any problems to vex anyone. They are seemingly kind of a painting like this seemingly represents a perfect world. And in this utopian perfect world, what do we have? We have examples of the great architecture of the past. So there is the Parthenon in Athens, and there are the aqueducts of ancient Rome. There's the Great Pyramid, there are the great cathedrals of Europe, and so on. And all of these buildings obviously are, in a sense, new in this image. In the architect's dream, each one of these buildings has been untouched by time. They've also been untouched in any sense by ordinary life. This is a landscape of monuments. There are no apartment blocks, there are no cafes, there are no bus stops. There is nothing that gives any indication of the things that may perhaps dominate or that we engage with in our daily lives. And all too often, this is what photographs of new architecture, visualizations of new architecture can look like. Perfected worlds from which ordinary life, and indeed the passage of time itself, has been banished. And I certainly dreamed at one point in my youth that when I became an architect, I would design similarly marbled monuments that would last forever and be uninterfered with by the vagaries of real life. But there's another thing that's going on inside this image as well. Because while it might appear to depict a timeless scene, in actual fact, time is very present in this scene indeed. And so if you look at the order in which the buildings are presented in the painting, what you will find is that they are arranged in a chronological order. So the furthest thing away is the Great Pyramid in the background, and then there's a later Egyptian temple, and then in the shadow of the Egyptian temple is a Greek temple, and then built on top of the Greek colonnade there's a Roman aqueduct, and then everything's dissolved into the water, and then in the dark on the left is a cathedral from the Dark Ages, and then there's the architect, and what does the architect hold in his hand? A piece of paper with a drawing for a building on it, a plan for something that hasn't happened yet. And so while this might seem to be an image of something that has never changed, it is in fact a painting of change. It's a painting of a conception of history which, as this talk unfolds, hopefully its relevance to particularly the work of Geoffrey Bawa and Carlo Scarpa will become more apparent. But it's also based on an assumption. What you can see in the quotation at the bottom of this slide is a statement about beauty, written by one of the first modern European theorists of architecture, Giambattista Alberti, who was writing in the 15th century in his treatise on architecture, De Re Edificatoria. And he says that beauty is that harmony and concord of all the parts, achieved in such a manner that nothing could be added or taken away or altered but for the worse. That is, that if we make something beautiful, it must never change. If we make something beautiful, it must never change. And this is an assumption that has made its way into discourses about the way that we think about the architecture of the past. This is one of the beautiful tomb tanks in between Govardhan and Vrindavan. And it's recently been restored to a kind of model of a very immaculate perfection. It's a kind of extraordinary encounter. The quotation below is from the human geographer Laura Jane Smith, where she talks about something that she names the authorized heritage discourse. She says the authorized heritage discourse, defines heritage as material, non-renewable and fragile. Its fragility requires that current generations must care for, protect and venerate these things so that they may be inherited by future generation. So when we encounter beautiful buildings or things from the past, very often we make the assumption that what we must do is preserve them. We must fix them in time. And in particular, we must remove them from our own time. We must keep them exactly as they were on the day they were built, whether that's 100 years ago or 500 years ago or whatever it might be. But in actual fact, that's not what tends to happen with historic buildings. I've entitled this image, an architect's nightmare, but actually it's one of my favourite buildings in the world, or one of my favourite images of architecture in the world. So this image is an image of a building that was originally a forum, that is a shopping centre in ancient Rome. And the image is from the 18th century and shows what had happened to that building over 1800 years. And I think what's fascinating is we get a sense of an extraordinary depth in time. In a sense, this building feels much older than that one, although they are both fairly historic structures. Why? Because change has happened to this building. This building is not in the state that was originally imagined or envisaged by its architect. And that's because, unbelievably to me, but something I soon learnt in architectural practice, architects aren't in fact omnipotent, and they don't know everything. And no building that is ever designed is perfect. Every building, when it is first built, is an attempt to make a self-maintaining whole, as Christopher Alexander says here, but predictions always go wrong, and people use buildings differently from the way that they thought they would. And that means when we go to real old cities, they look nothing like the architect's dream. Instead, what they represent, like Rome or here Varanasi, are conglomerations of buildings that have emerged over very, very long periods of time. So here's Aldo Rossi, a great architect of Venice, talking about his own city. And he says, in almost all cities there are large palaces, building complexes or agglomerations that constitute whole pieces of the city, and whose function is no longer the original one. When one visits a monument of this type, one is always surprised by a series of questions intimately associated with them. In particular, one is struck by a multiplicity of different functions that a building of this type can accommodate over time. And here we can see how a building that might have been built as a palace or a sanctuary is being used and turned into a small piece of city. So one might say, what a terrible thing, what a tragedy, how awful. But I suggest that given that this is going to happen anyway, we need to think more carefully about what opportunities it might present. I wanted to show you this image of a recent museum by the Austrian architect Carlo to show you just how radical you can be when you're dealing with historic buildings. This really matters because the majority of buildings that will exist in 2050 already exist. And therefore rebuilding and reoccupation hold the key to the future of our built environment. Building new buildings is not going to solve the problems of our environment because new buildings will always be the minority of the buildings in our environment. Existing buildings are the problem and we need to get them right. Why does this matter for the cities of the future? I wanted to show you this image. This is a Norman Foster smart city. This is Amaravati, but it could be Masdar in Saudi Arabia or wherever. To suggest that obviously it provides a kind of utopian dream of a future, but also that it proposes a future that in a sense exists without a past. A future from which the past has been removed. And as such, every problem is solved. There can be no future issues to deal with because this is a world or a city as a perfect machine where everything's been thought of, everything has been anticipated, and nothing could possibly go wrong. But how many cities of this sort actually exist in the world? Even Amaravati is built or is being built on an ancient site. And so even if we want to build utopian cities in the future, we need to think about how they are going to grow out of what already exists. How are they going to grow out of what already exists? And why does this matter for the buildings and the cities of the past? This is an image of excavations at Nalanda in 1919, 1920. And it, in a sense, takes us back to that authorised heritage discourse that Laura Jane Smith was talking about. The idea that if the past is there, it should be excavated, it should be preserved. And in order to do that, of course, it needs to be cleared. While this might seem to be a fairly harmless kind of image, let us imagine the consequences of this excavation for the farmers who live on the site at Nalanda in 1919 and 1920. Excavations of this sort were as much part of the colonial machine as anything as the cantonment, the railway, or whatever it might have been. And they relied, in a sense, and there's a curious sense that what they did under that regime in the 19th and early 20th centuries was look at Indian culture in particular and go, here is a wonderful ancient thing which is buried beneath the ground, which we will excavate, we'll put in museums, probably in London or Birmingham, and look at as if it was something from the past that can never change. Why does that matter now? This is a sign which I suspect we have all encountered many, many times as we travel around India, particularly those of us who are interested in historic buildings and historic sites. Usually this sign is unaccompanied by any information about what the site actually is. This is one at a place called Baraka in West Bengal, where there are some extraordinary medieval temples. But there is no sign that explains what the medieval temples were or might have been. Instead, there is this protected monument sign that tells us what you're not allowed to do on the site. And very often, the act of excavation, of preservation, involves clearing people off a site, building a wall around it, at least the wall here is being used for washing, and preventing people from getting near the site or living on it or engaging with it in any way. So it's about, in a sense, creating zones in which only the past may exist. In the same way that those utopian visions of the future are zones in which only the future can exist. And in between we have an anxious present where the future and the past are never allowed to meet. And I think this is an urgent and really important issue in a country that is developing as fast as India on the one hand, and with such an ancient and rich culture on the other at the same time, which means that developing the cities of the future from the cities of the past in the present is not an easy task. So in Mumbai, for example, there are all sorts of extraordinary and fascinating pieces of a former city or a past city that present us with fascinating problems. Watson's Hotel, for example, is among the earliest cast iron frame structures in the world. What should happen here? What could happen here? What might we do about a place like this? And that is not entirely and only a problem of architecture, because people live in architecture. People are in the building. Here's another slightly smaller scale kind of interior example of the same problematic. Will the Yazdani bakery live forever in exactly the same way? And if one was going to preserve it, what should one preserve about it? Is it the building? Is it the menu? Is it the staff? what is the thing that makes this particular important piece of Mumbai heritage heritage in that way. And that might be thought about at a larger scale too. What makes a place like the Banganga Tank fascinating is not just that it's ancient, but that it is also part of a rapidly developing modern city. How can both of those things speak to one another? How can you bring an ancient past and an exciting future together? And so there have been a number of projects that attempt to do this, and they have attracted fairly well-known controversies. So the clearing of space in central Varanasi, for example, has a practical aim, which is to allow more people to get to the key sites in the centre of the city. The difficulty is, how do you do that in the centre of a very ancient city? How do you make those things accessible? How do you decide what the key sites are or not? And dealing with that issue of, in a sense, monuments, historical monuments being surrounded by ordinary life, how do you square that circle? How do you get from the final vision, or how do you get to the final vision from where you are? What are just and practical ways of doing that? This is another key site at the moment, a really interesting one, the restoration of Chandni Chowk in Delhi, in Shah Jahanabad, and in a sense the desire to create a viable, a more kind of attractive and accessible public space within the middle of the city. This partly because of COVID and the ongoing things. I mean, all buildings run late and so on. This is a kind of ongoing project. Parts of it have been completed, parts of it have not. But the main issue that has to be dealt with here is endless patient negotiation with all the people who are living around the edges, the boundaries of this site. So while, for example, here we might see an 18th century mosque which has then been encroached upon and buried under large amounts of informal settlement, that informal settlement itself then becomes historic, layer by layer. So rather like those images that I showed you of Rome and its fate in the 18th century. How do we get from one to the other? It's the layers of a city that make it fascinating. So what, perhaps, I wanted to put, in a sense, some questions in your mind about what heritage should preserve. It strikes me those two examples of Benares and Delhi remind us that in India and South Asia, actually it's architecture and people that make cities. And that makes a fascinating thing out of heritage in itself. These are all examples of ancient heritage. Pandals for Durga Puja. I kind of quite enjoy the bagpiper whiskey one, the space shuttle, the Paris opera, the coronavirus, whatever they might be, however modern or alien they might appear, however topical they might be, they are manifestations of a very ancient tradition. And therefore, should they be construed as or understood as heritage? I remember seeing a talk by the great conservation heritage theorist Jukka Jokiletto a few years ago, where he showed a sacred rock. His sacred rock was in Japan. I'm showing you one here from Rajasthan. And he asks, what should be preserved? If you were going to apply heritage thinking to this stone here, what is it that should be preserved? Is it the stone itself, or is it the practice of painting it with vermilion? Is it the practice of devotion that might be worth preserving? Because in a sense, this is an object or a phenomenon that is made by the conversation between those two things. Here's the designer Bijoy Jain, the architect from Mumbai studio, doing the same in a sense with contemporary furniture. I think this is a really interesting piece of contemporary furniture where it is contemporary on the one hand, but the technique that's used to make it is a very ancient one. And so the creation of the modern contemporary object is, in a sense, the way of preserving the ancient tradition of craft. So the reason I'm trying to talk you through some of these issues from a particular perspective is to, in a sense, to bring this idea home that the past isn't something which just exists and sits there and should be preserved, but that the past is something which we are always reinventing. We're remaking it. And now what I want to do is turn particularly to the work of Geoffrey Bawa and Carlo Scarpa to examine ways in which the past can be reinvented, because what I want to suggest to you then is what we do with it isn't just an obstacle in the way of getting to the future, it's an opportunity, a creative opportunity. So I'm going to return to this building, which is the first building that I ever worked on as a kind of jejune project architect many years ago. And it might surprise you that this is a building that I worked on in my youth, because I look so young and lovely, and this building looks as if it's always been there. The walls are covered with kind of patchy ochre mud. The shutters of the window are worn away, and so on. And of course, that is entirely deliberate in this image. So the reason or the occasion of the construction of this house was the gift to Geoffrey Bawa, the architect, of the shutters on the right-hand side of this image and the little window on the left. This house, this building, was constructed to give these objects new life. But rather than giving them new life by putting them in a glass case in a museum or whatever it might be, they are built into a building. And this little house, it's a little guest house in Geoffrey Bawa's garden at Lunagunga on the southwest coast of Sri Lanka, looks out over this view of Geoffrey Bawa's garden. And I think this is one of the kind of fabulous and extraordinary view, because what it appears to be is a wilderness. What it appears to be is something which has always been there, a mangrove swamp in the lagoons on the southwest coast of Ceylon. Or so a lazy glance might give one to suppose, until your eye is arrested by the little castle on the right-hand side of the image. This castle isn't built in any style of architecture known in Sri Lanka at all. It's a direct quotation from the gardens in particular of John Vanbrugh, an 18th century architect in Britain in the 18th century. And the positioning of this castle on the right hand of this view, framing it, in a sense, turns this piece of apparently wild, untouched mangrove wilderness into a landscape garden. And what a very crafty landscape garden this is. Lunagunga was built during the 1960s and 70s, or as a continuous process. Like all great gardens, it's something that took decades to put together. The elements you can see here are part of some of the stories that this garden helps to tell. On the left-hand side, we can see another column. This is a column taken from a colonial era house in the locality of the garden. And the garden, I beg your pardon, is filled with architectural fragments of this sort: shutters, windows, columns, doors, jars, statues, things that have been picked up. In particular, things that have been picked up because the buildings from which they came were being demolished. If you've ever driven up and down the Gaul Road in Sri Lanka, the old Gaul Road, not the motorway, but the old Gaul Road, you will know that it's been in a continuous state of demolition over the last 50 years, and I suspect a great deal longer. And the column that we can see on the left-hand side here would have once supported a veranda that gave out onto the road in one of the villages. As the road was widened, the verandas were chopped off the houses, and then as the road was widened even more, the main rooms of the houses were chopped off, and so on. And you see this, and we've seen this in many cities under development, the way that the fronts of houses get sliced off. And so what Lunaganga becomes is a recomposition of this vanishing world of the Gaul Road in lazier, slower times, where, in a sense, these beautiful furniture-like columns were made. In the middle of the image here, you can see something else, another story that's being told. This little building, which looks rather like a Balinese temple, or perhaps a small shrine in Kerala or indeed in Sri Lanka, is called the Hen House. And the reason it's called the Hen House is because when it was being built in the 1970s in Sri Lanka, this was in its period of self-reliance. No imports were allowed, for example, and the idea of a garden was more or less unacceptable. All land had to be productive. And so during that time, Bawa had to make it appear as if his beautiful landscape garden was in fact a farm. So here is the hen house, and here is the cow barn, and so on. This is a construction, a story of a farm that was never really a farm, but when the inspectors turned up, he could always say, well, you know, here is the farm. What you can see, for example, the cow shed here was a kind of veranda with, and you can just see it in the background, a mural by the artist Lucky Senanayake of kind of the Ramayana, actually, of Rama coming to Lanka, painted in it. So it becomes a kind of ornamental garden space. But what's happening in this extraordinary garden are illusions, like webs of very beautiful illusions. That this is an untouched landscape, that it's a farm, that it's Sri Lanka as it has always been. But all of it has only come into existence since or over the last 4 or 5 decades. So it is in fact an entirely modern confection. And it's a modern confection that tells very particular stories. So the garden is filled with these very beautiful jars, and the story that Bawa used to tell about them is that they were brought to the island on Portuguese ships from China. So they're being used as ballast. And he also talks about the tiles that cover the roofs of all of his buildings. He says, take the Sinhala tile, so it was called. And he says, you know, where does this Sinhala tile, this supposedly absolutely national tile, come from? Well, it's brought by the Arabs from Spain, who inherited it from Rome. And the garden, in a sense, becomes, in all its dreamy illusion, in a sense, a fantasy about a Sri Lanka that is connected to the rest of the world by networks of trade and cultural transmission. And so this garden of fragments reassembled tells us a very interesting and beautiful series of stories about history and the history of the place from which it came. This is an art which Bawa loved playing by arranging and working with objects in particular. So here is his townhouse in Colombo, where there's this wonderful, again, unexpected collage of elements. So the Rolls Royce on the right hand side of the picture, the Dutch colonial piece of furniture, the Portuguese jar, the owl, the gilded sculpture on the wall by Lucky Sendanayake as well. And then as you move through, a colonnade from a Chettinad house from South India that's kind of collaged into the building. And yet all this is done without fuss. In a sense, it's a wonderful piece, an example of kind of what interior design can do, the arrangement, the really beautiful, elegant arrangement of spaces. What makes this modern, not the things, because none of them are modern, it's the way that these things are arranged in relationship to one another. The way that they ask questions of one another. What does a Rolls Royce have to say to an 18th century Dutch seat? What does a Portuguese jar have to say to a Chettinad colonnade or whatever it might be? And so the juxtaposition, the putting of these objects together asks questions, not just of the past, but of the present. I wanted to show you a couple of images of things where I think this is being done in a very interesting way. This is a new chain of restaurants. What I want to do is bring some examples back to Mumbai several times. And here it struck me as kind of quite an amusing example. This looks at first glance perhaps like Kiani's restaurant might look like in your dreams or fantasies or in a film. But in actual fact, this interior is part of a chain of Mumbaikar restaurants that have opened in London over the last few years, Dishoom's. And so here's the original Kiani's, and here is the kind of reconstructed fantasy version of Kiani's in London. And Dishoom has been this kind of extraordinary culinary restaurant success, but I think actually a really fascinating success to do with interior design and the power of this kind of Bawa-esque juxtaposition of objects. So apparently what we get in these interiors at Dishoom is what one might call kind of, it's like production design in the movies. Okay, so somebody goes and they find all the pictures and the right lamps and the right chairs and the right tables and so on to give the illusion of something somewhere else. So in a warehouse in Shoreditch in East London, we suddenly have a kind of fantasy mid-20th century Bombay being recreated, down to every detail, down to the paint peeling off the brick and the steel conduiting for the electric wires and whatever it might be. But of course, this is all a very clever piece of fantasy. And it's kind of a fantasy that's taken through in every detail. So the rules of the cafe: no smoking, no spitting, no washing hands in plates and glass, no outside food, no combing hair, no flirting with the cashier. It's in a sense kind of props or kind of theatrical kind of pieces of scenery that one might imagine being in the background of a movie from 20 or 30 years ago. An extraordinary and wonderful piece of theatre. An extraordinary and wonderful piece of theatre about spaces like the Irani cafes of Bombay that are in their own right kind of pieces of theatre. The theatres of all sorts of interesting conversations between different people, hiding from their parents, meeting all the wrong sorts of people they're not meant to be meeting, and then the way that those Irani cafes themselves make their way into film and storytelling about the city. So Bawa, it strikes me, offers this tremendous opportunity to tell stories about our relationship with the past and our heritage. This is perhaps the most extreme example. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Kingdom of Dreams in Gurgaon, which is a kind of shopping mall. It's kind of Las Vegas shopping mall. And what you'll see on the left, of course, is Bombay, on the right, Lucknow, and the bridge in between them in this shopping mall underneath a kind of painted and translucent sky. So now I'm going to move on to my first building, this one, and talk a little bit about the work of Carlo Scarpa and how it might tell a very particular story about our relationship with the past. This building I worked on when I got back from Sri Lanka in the middle of the 1990s. It was a day clinic for cancer patients in the Western General Hospital here in Edinburgh, and it involved the conversion of a stable. You can see what it was like before on the left-hand side, and a conversion of a stable into this clinic on the right. And what you can see that we did was a very simple kind of process, which was to, in a sense, put a new modern building made of glass blocks and red painted steel and so on inside the existing building. Okay, to put a new building inside the existing building. But as you can see, the composition of the existing building then becomes something which is different to the composition of the existing building. So this isn't preservation. There wasn't any attempt to make the stable appear as it had always been. Instead, we wanted to show that something had changed. This is a practice or a way of doing it that we learned from the architecture of Carlo Scarpa, who was working in and around Venice in northern Italy in the 50s, 60s, 70s of the last century. And I just want to take you through a couple of the details of the way that Scarpa worked to explain a very different principle of working with the past to the one that we've just seen in Sri Lanka. So this is the entrance hall to a building called the Querini Stampalia Foundation, built by Scarpa or designed by Scarpa in Venice in 1961. And if we look carefully around this space, we might see that several things are going on. The arch in the middle of the image is telling us that this building is in fact quite an old building. In fact, it's a 16th century palace in the middle of Venice, and you can see the ancient brick walls of that palace through the arch. And what you can see on the left-hand side is another arch which is open. There's a kind of metal grille that's open to the air. And then in between them is this floor. And this floor has a kind of rim around the edge of it. And as you can see, that rim kind of comes in and out of the room. So the floor of this room never meets the walls of the room. Might seem like a kind of curiosity. The floor of this room never meets the walls of the room. And that floor is made of this kind of shiny, modern, hard-cut terrazzo, okay, which is quite a contrast to the rough, older brick that makes the envelope of the room. And in this image, you can begin to see why this new floor has been placed in this old room. And that is because in the time that has elapsed between the centuries when the palace was built in the 16th century and the 20th century, when Carlo Scarpa made his intervention to the building, something has changed in Venice. And that thing that has changed in Venice is the level of the water. Venice now floods much more regularly than it did in the 16th century, which means that the ground floor of buildings in Venice, or the ground floors of buildings in Venice, are regularly flooded. And so Scarpa's new floor in this ancient room is designed to not just cope practically with that issue, but to dramatize it. So now when I arrive in my gondola in the arch on the left-hand side of the image from the canal outside, I can actually bring the boat inside the room and step out into these new modern steps and up into this boat-like floor of the new foundation that's sitting inside here. Scarpa's best known masterpiece is perhaps this one, the Castelvecchio Museum in Verona. And if you look at the dates here, you'll see that actually he spent an enormously long time in building it, almost as long as Geoffrey Bawa did in building his garden. And what you can see from this image is that the Castelvecchio Museum, it's now a museum, but it certainly wasn't built as a museum, was in fact an extremely ancient building. There's a wall on the left-hand side of this image, which takes us right back to that idea of repeated change over centuries. Part of that wall is Roman, part of it is 12th century, part of it is 19th century. Some of the holes that have been made in it are 20th century. And on the right-hand side, you can see a building that looks apparently medieval also, from the 14th or 15th century, rather like the Palazzi of Venice. And what Scarpa did in the 1960s in remodeling this ancient building, this many, many layered building, was create this extraordinary moment where the building on the right-hand side of the image meets the wall on the left. And there's kind of something here which could only be from the 1960s or the 1970s. It's as if the tiles on the roof have been peeled back to reveal a kind of sharp metal roof that's sliding out from underneath them. It's as if the building as a whole has been cut back to reveal this network of passages and balconies and bridges and so on, in the middle of which is suspended a statue of a knight on horseback. That knight on horseback is one of the Scaligeri family, who were the family that built this medieval castle in the Middle Ages, or rebuilt the old Roman castle that was there. So what is Scarpa suggesting to us here? Well, in the same way that he did at the Corini Stampalia, he's suggesting or trying to expose the idea that historic buildings are not single things. They're not single perfect objects to which nothing may be added and nothing taken away, but instead that they are composed of many, many layers that have been built up over time. And what he's tried to do, and this happens in detail in the Castelvecchio as well as in general plan and section, is to peel back layers in very subtle ways, to expose what was underneath, to expose just how layered the building or the buildings were, to give us a sense of quite how much change has taken place over the centuries. And this is a technique that has become particularly popular in Europe for all sorts of reasons over the past decades, and has become, in a sense, absolutely the way that we deal with historic buildings in Europe, whether it's the Reichstag in Germany, which is very deliberately the reconstruction of a ruin. The building was burnt down by Hitler, or allegedly burnt down by Hitler, and was a ruin for many years, all through the time of the division of the Germanies, and at unification it's not restored. Instead, the ruin is reoccupied by Norman Foster's new glass and steel structure. In Berlin again, a wonderful use of the dramatization of that process of ruin and renewal that the nation of Germany has undergone in the 20th century. The Neues Museum is a museum that was built in the 19th century as a museum of classical ancient and Roman sculpture. It was bombed in the Second World War and completely gutted, and has stood as a ruin for most of the 20th century, for the rest of the 20th century, until the architect David Chipperfield reoccupied it with its original exhibits, classical sculptures, in the early decade of the 21st century. And I think there's a wonderful sense that you can see here about the poetry of the ruins of ancient classical sculpture taken from ruined Roman and Greek buildings, now built into the ruin of a 19th century German building, which is kind of reoccupied. So it's about the repeated reoccupation of ruins. And that association between culture and cultural buildings in particular, and the reoccupation of the buildings of the past is particularly crucial. Here is probably the biggest arts project in the UK in the last 20 years. The new Tate Modern opened in 1999, so kind of at a historically significant moment. We're about to enter a new millennium. Where do we put our primary art museum? We put it in an old power station, in the turbine hall of an old power station, and the building, the reuse is designed in such a way to make it completely obvious and apparent to everyone who's there that this had a former industrial use. This is one of my favourite examples of how it's done, the Centrale Montemartini Museum in Rome, which exhibits a whole load of classical sculptures, again, inside a power station. But this idea of juxtaposing the ancient and the modern has reached kind of new radical heights. This is perhaps the most radical example of that that I can think of in Europe at the moment, Zaha Hadid's kind of reworking of the Antwerp Port Authority in Belgium, this kind of extraordinary way that a 19th century building is kind of a spaceship has come to land on the roof. And that is working its way globally. One of my students actually showed me this project a couple of weeks ago. It's a new poetry bookshop in Shanghai by Wutopia Lab, which is in fact the reoccupation of a Russian Orthodox church. So they built this extraordinary new kind of silo space inside the existing church, and through the kind of slats of the new installation, which is in a sense an extension of the bookshelf, you can see the original building. And then it's interesting to see how this approach might be working its way out in a city like Mumbai. So with Brinda Somaya's TCS house and the reoccupation and the beautiful restoration also of some of the buildings in the Bawa estate, for example. I kind of really enjoyed this one, which is the kind of reverse process. In a sense, it's rather more like Geoffrey Bawa's house that I was working on. The S&PS architects this kind of collage house, put together partly through the reuse of all these windows salvaged from other constructions in the city. Samit Patura's kind of radical reoccupation of a store, so there's kind of 19th century Indo-Saracenic exterior to this building, which then hides and kind of houses something quite different inside it. But actually kind of what's interesting is the view that you get from looking from the street outside into the interior space within. And then very thoughtful reuses of industrial buildings, obviously with which Bombay is blessed in great number. How can we reuse these industrial spaces? And in a sense, while you might get a general impression of why that's interesting on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, I really like the way that there's a kind of detailed consideration. This is something Scarpa would do, of thinking really thoughtfully and in detail about how you might reuse the existing staircase. So here's, in a sense, this idea about collaging and playing with the past comes out of, on the one hand, a very strong commitment to heritage. So here's a statement from kind of Italian kind of resolutions on heritage. Architectural monuments from the past are not just valuable for the study of architecture, but they contribute as essential documents to explain and illustrate all the facets of the history of various peoples throughout the ages. They should therefore be scrupulously and religiously respected as documents, in which any alteration, however slight, if it appears to be part of the original, could be misleading. And so, in a sense, Scarpa's doctrine of radical new re-interventions into historic buildings is the opposite of Bawa's idea. So, in a sense, if the gardens at Lunaganga create this beautiful illusion of a place which is somehow in the present and the past at the same time, what the Scarpian doctrine does is it makes clear the division between the past and the present, very particularly evident. I'm going to finish up with a very, very quick thought about other practices that have taken place. In a sense, Bawa and Scarpa were working in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. What's happened since? And I'm going to take you to a place just outside Glasgow in Scotland I've been working with over the last decade or so. This building, St Peter's Seminary, which was built, kind of finished as a modern monastery, a seminary for training priests in 1967. Everyone loved the building at the time. They thought it was fantastic. It got all sorts of awards and so on. But by the middle of the 1980s, it was abandoned by the church, quite simply because there weren't enough priests to train. And this is what has happened to that space. It has become a ruin. And over the past decade or so, I've been working with an artist group, NVA, in Glasgow, to think about ways that we could draw attention to the plight of this building, but also to think about ways that it might be reoccupied. And we held a series of workshops early in the decade to experiment with this idea. We invited people to come to the building, to enter the building, and to collect items from it and exhibit them in a museum as if they were from ancient history rather than the 1960s. We invited people to imagine the future of the building over different periods of time, whether it's 5 months, 5 years, or 500 years. And in a sense, I'm showing you these things to suggest that there's something about ruins, in particular buildings that are in a problematic condition, that invites play. Here is Tim Edenshaw, a human geographer in the UK, writing about industrial ruins and saying, that industrial buildings in particular are built as machines to produce things. But what happens when they no longer produce things, no longer do the things that they were designed to do? At that moment, they become spaces that invite all sorts of different possibilities. And so over more recent years, there have been really interesting reuses of industrial buildings or buildings that are not valued in quite the same way. Here, for example, is Assemble Architects in 2010 working on finding a new temporary reuse for an old petrol station in suburban London, which they transformed with the use of this kind of silver curtain into this wonderful temporary cinema. This would only exist for a couple of months, and then obviously somebody comes along, they've bought the site, they'll remove the petrol station, they'll build a more permanent building there. But for those moments in between, it becomes a celebratory kind of festival space. This is Jorge Otoropoulos, who I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, working with heritage in a really different way. He would paint historic buildings with latex to collect all the dust that's on them, and then peel the latex off and exhibit it in this extraordinary way. So you get a sense of all you're seeing here is the dust, the decay of the historic building. Here, Alejandro Aravena in Chile is applying the same playfulness to the design of housing. So looking at what he provided as an architect is what we can see on the left-hand side of this image, houses which are deliberately not complete, which encouraged the people who bought them. They're kind of fairly low-cost buildings because they're not complete, which encourages people to reuse them or build them in different ways. And so what you can see on the right-hand side of the image here is this lovely way in which something which starts out as very uniform and strict ends up as playful and delightful and variegated. This book, I think, is a really interesting one, co-authored by Rahul Malhotra and architects from Latin America, looking at ephemeral urbanism in this way. It's a great reminder that, and this book looks at festivals from the Burning Man to the Kumbh Mela or Glastonbury or whatever it might be, but it reminds us that all architecture is temporary. All architecture is undergoing a process of change all the time. And we can't stop that happening. All we can do is to try to take advantage of it. So I'm going to finish up with two projects which are about this sort of ephemeral urbanism. This one is one that's quite close to my heart. It's the Scottish Cemetery in Kolkata. And as you might imagine, with lots of cemeteries of this sort, it faces an obvious problem. It was designed to bury all sorts of people who now no longer have any relatives or any connections to the city of Kolkata. Nobody is left to come to visit the grave of Charles Maxton Manners. And what that means, as you can see, is that an environment like this falls into ruination. What can one do about this? Well, there have been several attempts, and I think what's kind of interesting is that, yes, you can restore this place. You could repair the tombs, you could mow the grass and so on, but what would be the point of doing such a thing? Why do it? Who would that heritage be for? And what's been really fascinating is that the Scottish Kolkata Heritage Trust have worked in a very inventive way to think about that particular question. So they've mapped the area around the Scottish cemetery, looking at what it's used for, and what they've generally found is that it's an area of the town that used to be quite prosperous. It's now much less so. And all the black that you can see on this map here is car mechanics workshops. It's also an area whose population has massively changed. So it's lots of refugees and people who've moved from Bangladesh in recent years who don't have any attachment to the original purpose of the cemetery. And what Nita Das and her team, who've been working on the site over recent years, have done is they've kind of realised that unless you engage these people who live around the graveyard, you can restore the buildings all you like, but it's not going to make any difference. And so what's great about this space now is it's not just a place you go and mourn the Scottish dead from 100 years ago, but it's a school, it's a nursery where you can grow plants. It takes advantage of the open space in the city to provide something which is used by the living and for the living. That won't produce any gorgeous, glamorous architecture to look at, but in terms of providing a space that people can use, it's a tremendously important service that architectural reuse can perform. And I'd like to thank Nita for the rights to use these pictures here. And I just wanted to end up with this one. The Bandra Collective, the skate park at Carter Road, which has come together in recent months. What I really enjoy about this is a bit of city that might be unloved, might be redundant, could be forgotten about. What's happened here is that actually reuse has been provoked as much by a coat of paint and no more. Than that. This isn't a matter of reconstructing at vast scale and expense and difficulty a whole area of city, but about inventively working with what's there. And that returns me to my original thought, or Bertolt Brecht's original thought. Anybody can be creative. It's rewriting other people that's difficult. It's tempting always to imagine that we can either invent completely new worlds or preserve ancient worlds exactly as they were and they were meant to be. But the world is in a process of constant change, and that includes the buildings that inhabit the world. As I said, in a century's time, we already know what the world's going to look like because most of the world of a century's time already exists. We can't wipe it away. We can't clean it up. What we need to do is to learn to live with it. And instead of imagining that living with what exists is an obstacle in the way of our creativity, we need to imagine how it is in fact its greatest spur. So I shall finish there, and thank you very much.
Ed, I think you have a few questions, not too many.
Right.
So if you want to
Okay.
take those.
Yeah. So I'm seeing one about the Musée d'Orsay, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the Musée d'Orsay is one of the first really big projects, actually, which undertook this particular thing in Paris. So it was, and if one imagines it was the 1980s when it happened, that it did an extraordinary thing, which was take a railway station and then reimagine a railway station as an art gallery. And I think that is an extraordinary kind of moment. There's also a particular appropriateness to it in the sense that one of the great subjects of the Impressionist artists who were in the Musée d'Orsay was the railway and that sense of modernity. You talk about Chandigarh, and I think it's a fascinating issue in the sense that Chandigarh is literally one of those cities that was kind of designed in one go, as a kind of single work of art, or so it seems. So, the story of Chandigarh is very often told as, Le Corbusier kind of parachuted in from wherever and kind of invented this single work of art. What I think would be interesting to consider there is, first of all, that's not a strictly true story. Chandigarh was never finished, and certainly never finished quite as Le Corbusier intended. And secondly, it's been subject to all sorts of reoccupations since the 1950s and it's being built. Look, I remember staying there once and staying in a youth hostel, which had been designed by Le Corbusier, and it was like sleeping in a cathedral or a temple. It was all made of concrete, and it was this kind of gigantic spaces that kind of echoed through the night. And actually, it struck me as a wonderful place for reoccupation because the original architecture, Corbusier's concrete architecture, is so incredibly tough that actually you could do anything to it. So around the base of the Secretariat building when I was there, all sorts of informal tea shops and everything had appeared. And I thought actually it was rather like Piranesi's Rome. It kind of looked beautiful in that way. And those buildings are tough enough to survive that. Okay, I'm seeing some of the Q&As. Thanks very much. Yeah, there's that sort of great. Okay. Yeah, so a question from Dr. Vishika Karnad. While reinventing past structures in contemporary times, how does one decide what features to retain and what to adapt? I think this comes back to this question about what story you want to tell. It is always selective. There is no single true story that you could tell about any building in the world. One metaphor is sometimes used to explain the idea of a building through time is the metaphor of a fairy story. So if I said the words Cinderella to you or Little Red Riding Hood or whatever it might be, then in a sense there's no one true telling of that, no correct version, no original version. And that's true of buildings too. They change throughout time in all sorts of different ways. So I think you need to think always about what is the key story that you want to tell. Secondly, to ask yourself about value. What do you value, or what should people or could people value? One of the conversations I have with my students a lot is relating to adding things to historic structures and taking them away. So, for example, at the moment, I'm working with them on a library in Edinburgh that was built in the early 19th century, so it's about 200 years old. And we were talking about it's built out of timber, and we were talking about removing some of the timber work, and then we were going, okay, so that timber has been there for 200 years, and that's just dead. So imagine how long the tree had lived before that, and we're going back 700 years, and what you want to do is cut it away and throw it on the fire. So you better have a pretty good reason for doing that. Okay, sort of for something that has been in the world for 700 years, what might you kind of do with it? A question about cities and heritage and architecture that has inhabitants. Absolutely, I think this is the crucial issue. There is no such thing as empty space anywhere. The outback in Australia is not empty. There's no, the densest cities of India are not empty, and it's remembering kind of what, and this comes back to those questions I was asking about, what should we preserve? That cities, buildings is one layer of it. The things that happen in buildings is another layer of it. The people that live there are another layer of it. And I want you to imagine that as being rather like the Amazon rainforest, which is an incredibly complex ecology of animals and plants, and the richness of the earth in the forest is something that has taken thousands of years to assemble. And it's incredibly dangerous just to cut that away and go, oh, we'll relocate the people over there, we'll rebuild the buildings over there, we'll tidy it all up. It will all look much neater in a photograph. But actually, what's happened to that ecology? The wealth of a city is in its people. The resource of a city, unlike a mine or any other natural resource, the wealth of a city is its people. And so how can the city act as a fertile ground for cultivating them? Kate Dyson, back to the beginning, and Thomas Cole's painting. Which 20th and 21st century buildings would I add to the image? Very good question. I have a million people going, oh no. Well, curiously, I am biased in this. I would find myself adding reconversions of the buildings that are in the paintings. So in a sense, yes, I could add the Gherkin in London. I think is a wonderful kind of object building. But in a curious way, I'd be more interested to see what would happen if somebody tried to turn the Temple of Luxor into a block of flats, or the Parthenon into a swimming pool. Because it's kind of, I think that's in a curious way where that kind of creativity kind of comes about. There's a question from Mokita here. Who gets to decide if a building has historic merit? Absolutely, it's a question of power. I mean, it's kind of why I was showing you an image of colonial archaeology in India. Who got to decide what was historically important in India in the 19th century? The British. Now, there's a kind of curiosity in that situation. I think often we need to always remember that kind of sometimes heritage can be a very top-down thing. It's something we associate with governments. And that is something we need to be careful about, because governments can decide what's important or not. But actually, on the ground, it's the people who live with things that decide what is important or not. And how one negotiates between those two is really, really crucial. The kind of local importance of something to people. There might be things which look like nothing to you and me, but actually to the people that are there, they're tremendously important. So, I mean, I would encourage everybody who is interested in historic buildings to voice their opinions on not just historic buildings, but existing buildings. things become heritage because people decide they become heritage, and it's really important that people say what they believe to be important to them. When does one, or you're saying where and how does one draw the land in the sand, draw in the sand of time? It's kind of when. I think kind of one of the curiosities of recent years is that certainly in Europe, heritage has become more and more recent. Okay, which is a kind of weird thing, so that more and more recent things get preserved. Sahil asks, can the concept of utopian cities help to restore heritage buildings? Yes, it can, but I think that we need to be really careful when we're talking about utopias, that utopias don't involve the erasure of the whole past in order to make the future. I think certainly throughout my lifetime, and I'm unbelievably ancient, obviously, but it's that in the 60s and 70s, the future had a capital F, and it was incredibly exciting, and everyone would have silver spacesuits, and everything would be shiny. And that kind of involved, what would actually happen to a medieval building in that world? And the answer is it just wouldn't exist, which is why when you look at so many sci-fi buildings, the world's being destroyed by a nuclear war, because it conveniently tidies the past away. There's something I always really, really loved about Star Wars, is that in Star Wars, the countries had a history. The buildings were dirty. Things had been reused and changed over time. Where does it begin? It begins in a junk store where they're selling old robots. And in a sense, of course, we need a sense about the future, but I don't think that sense of the future should be something that should be kind of detached from the past. Kamalika, why do you think the same people, audience who appreciate and love the Kingdom of Dreams, have contorted them in strange ways and not to manage their original settings and need to preserve them? A very good question. I do love the Kingdom of Dreams, but it's a weird kind of sanitized version of reality. So what it does is its history and locality with all the problems taken away. In a sense, its origin is Las Vegas. I don't know how many have been to Las Vegas, but it's kind of this weird and wonderful thing. You go to Venice, you go to Paris, you go to Rome, but it's Venice and Paris and Rome with all the problems removed. And the curious thing about something like the Kingdom of Dreams is it does that. It's something that, in a sense, tourism itself is actually a kind of very double-edged sword in this way. In that, what on the one hand, why do people travel? Why do people go on holiday? They go to look at historic cities, and I know this because I live in Edinburgh, which is a historic city, and millions of people turn up to see it in that light every day. But they're also on holiday, which means they would like a cappuccino to appear exactly when required, and the hotel bed to be of exactly the right fluffiness, and so on, which in a sense is about removing any of the possible problems one might be encountering with an existing thing. And so what tends to happen, as you're kind of hinting at, is the extraordinary thing that the real thing actually gets destroyed, or because it's in the way, it's too inconvenient, it's too dirty, it's too messy, it's too problematic. And that becomes a kind of real curiosity. So where I live in the centre of Edinburgh is the kind of ancient medieval centre of Edinburgh. Luckily, plumbing arrived about 50 years ago, which I'm quite glad about. But in a sense, it's become, until COVID anyway, and the tourists disappeared, it became a kind of very sanitized version of itself, a kind of fairground version of its own reality.
I think, Ed, we're at time right now. But thank you for sharing such interesting insights and your vision of how heritage can be revived and reinvented. I know we had some wonderful conversations earlier in the week. You talked about the Children's Hospital in Edinburgh has been
Yes, yeah.
restored to a new use, and in Mumbai, something that we're involved with is the Royal Opera House. Besides being restored, you talked about the timber. Even the stage of the Royal Opera House was remade with reclaimed wood from ships. And it's not just restoring the building, it's bringing new life to it. There are some wonderful, a handful of good examples, at least in Mumbai. But I thank you again. I mean, I'm trying to remember, is this your third Avid session or your second or fourth?
Third,
Anyway,
yeah.
third, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
They say third time's the charm, but each time you come back and we learn something new and we're excited. And thank you for this. Special thank you to our partners, the University of Edinburgh, for collaborating with us. Thank you to our participants for being here. And hope you've gained some great perspectives on this fascinating topic. Stay tuned. We have many engaging programs as the holiday season comes around. Tune in. Next week is a robust week. We've got two very interesting, Ed, I already kind of alluded to it, and it's interesting how we planned it so they all kind of tie into each other. On Thursday the 10th, we have Enduring Legacies, Cultural Heritage and Architecture in a Future India, and followed by on Saturday the 12th, a week from today, we have From the Outside Looking In, the Western perspective of India's captivating culture. Find out more, just follow us on social media or check out our website. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and remember that learning never stops. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ed, once again.